Grief has a way of turning a house into silence, and a man into a ghost of himself. But on one bitter October morning, everything changes when a broken cry leads him to 3 children guarding a grave, believing their mother is only sleeping. What follows is a story of loss, faith, and a second chance that no one saw coming. Stay with me, because some stories don't just touch your heart, they reshape it.
The wind out here doesn't howl, it scrapes. It drags across the Wyoming plains like a dull blade, peeling the last of the dead leaves off the cottonwoods. October of '82. Cold enough to freeze the breath in your throat. Cold enough to make a man reconsider stepping out his front door. I was out by the eastern fence line, just me, a hammer, and a pocket full of iron nails. Old Ned had swung by the barn earlier that morning, asked if I was heading into town. I told him no. I didn't need anything from Miller's Crossing, didn't need anything from anywhere. 4 years. That's how long it had been since Mary died. 4 years since the house went quiet. You get used to it after a while. The silence, I mean. It stops being something missing. It becomes a kind of blanket. A heavy one, sure, but you learn to sleep under it. I worked the cattle. I fixed the fences. I read Ecclesiastes by the fire. I went to sleep. That was the routine. That was the whole world. Until I heard the sound. I stopped hammering, kept my head down, listened. It wasn't a coyote. Coyotes, yip, they screamed. This was a sob, a jagged, broken thing, and it wasn't just one. It was a chorus of them, thin and weak, coming from the edge of my property down by the Snake River. I dropped the hammer in the dirt. I didn't bother picking it up. I got on my horse, rode slow. I didn't know what I was riding into. A wolf pack circling a stray calf. A drifter in trouble. But as I got closer, the sound cleared. It wasn't an animal, it was kids. There's a lone oak tree down by the river bend. Ground's hard there, roots run deep. The grass is usually tall, but the frost had killed it back. Under that tree I saw them, 3 kids, kneeling in the dirt. The oldest was a boy, maybe 8 years old. The youngest was another boy, hair like dried autumn wheat. He wasn't crying anymore, just hiccuping, breathing in small, broken gasps, too exhausted to make a real sound. Between them was a girl, maybe 6. She was shivering so hard I could see her shoulders shaking from 50 yards away. They were wearing city clothes, good wool, good stitching, eastern clothes, completely useless against a Wyoming wind. And right in front of them was a mound of fresh dirt. A makeshift cross stood at the head of it. 2 thick branches tied together with a piece of purple ribbon, 3 dead wildflowers laid on top of the soil. No headstone, no name. I slid off my horse. I didn't rush. You don't rush wild mustangs, and you sure don't rush terrified children. I took my hat off, let them see my face, let them see I wasn't hiding anything. I stopped about 10 yards away, waited. The oldest boy heard my boots in the brush. He snapped his head up. He didn't run. He didn't cry for help. He grabbed a heavy branch from the ground, held it like a club. He stepped right in front of the little ones, putting his small body between me and that patch of turned earth. "Don't come any closer, mister." His voice shook. But his eyes didn't. They were hard, desperate. "I'm just passing through, son," I said. I kept my voice low, flat, the way I talk to a spooked colt. "Whose land do you think you're on?" "Don't care. Our mama's here. We're waiting on her." I looked at the dirt. I looked back at the boy. "Waiting on her to do what, son?" The little girl peeked out from behind his coat. Her face was streaked with mud and tears. "To wake up," she whispered. The oldest boy shushed her, but she kept talking. Her teeth were chattering. "Uncle Edward said she was just sleeping. He said if we were good, and if we prayed really hard, she'd wake up." I felt a cold drop in my gut. It had nothing to do with the wind coming off the river. "Where is Uncle Edward now?" I asked. "He went to get food," the older boy said. His grip on the branch tightened. His knuckles were white. "Yesterday. He said stay here. He said we can't go anywhere. So we're staying." I looked at the grave again. The soil was loose, shallow, not dug by a man who cared about keeping the prairie wolves out, dug by a man in a hurry, a man who wanted to get back on the road. I estimated the depth. 3 feet, maybe. Yesterday. 18. Maybe 24 hours ago. I closed my eyes, just for a second. But a second is all it takes to go back 19 years. Gettysburg, July, 1863. I was a field medic in the Union Army. Barely a man myself. They gave me a bucket of water, a tin cup, and told me to walk through the aftermath of Pickett's charge. My job was simple: check the bodies, figure out who went into the ground and who went onto the surgeon's table. 200 men laid out in the grass. I learned something real quick in that bloody field. You don't trust the stillness. I saw men pronounced dead by exhausted captains, men whose pulses were still beating, faint as a moth's wing. I saw a corporal from Ohio buried on a Tuesday in a mass trench. He woke up in the medical tent on Thursday. Why? Because some tired surgeon didn't press hard enough at his throat. Because someone took another man's word for it. I made a vow to God that week. I would never take another man's word about death. Not ever. Not until I checked the throat. Not until I checked the wrist. Not until I felt the cold myself. I opened my eyes. I looked at the boy holding the branch. Son, what's your name? He hesitated. Thomas. Thomas. I need you to do something for me. I need you to trust me for about 2 minutes. Thomas raised the branch higher. No, she's sleeping. You can't wake her. Uncle Edward said— I don't care what your Uncle Edward said, I interrupted. Soft, but firm. I'm not going to wake her. I'm just going to make sure she's comfortable. That's what good men do. We check. He didn't lower the stick, but he didn't swing it either. He was just a kid. A terrified, freezing kid who had been sitting by a dirt mound all night. I walked up to the grave. I dropped to my knees. I didn't have a shovel. I didn't care. I used my hands. The ground was freezing on the top layer, but the soil underneath was loose. My fingers dug in. The dirt packed under my fingernails. My knuckles scraped against hidden rocks. I threw the dirt to the side. Handful after handful. The kid stood right behind me, watching, too stunned to stop me, too tired to run. 2 feet down. 3. That was all it took. The coward didn't even dig a proper grave. My fingers hit fabric. Wool, navy blue, high quality. I brushed the dirt away. Fast now, frantic. A face appeared in the earth. She was young, dark hair completely matted with wet clay and roots. Her skin was the color of old marble. Her lips were blue, tinged with purple. Her face had the absolute terrifying stillness of carved stone. But there was no smell, no scent of decay. Not yet. The freezing Wyoming ground. It's like an icebox. It slows the blood, it slows the heart, it slows everything down to a crawl. I took off my heavy leather work glove. I wiped my right hand on my denim pants to get the mud off. I leaned down into the shallow hole. I pressed my fingers to the side of her neck, right below the jawline. Cold. Nothing. I found her wrist buried under a fold of her wool coat. I pressed my thumb against the pale skin. Nothing. Not a flutter. Not a jump. My chest tightened. I was a fool. An old man chasing ghosts from a war that ended a lifetime ago. I was violating a woman's grave in front of her children for nothing. I started to pull my hand back. But my oath. Never trust the stillness. I leaned down further. I placed my bare palm flat against her cold blue lips. I closed my eyes, and I waited. 1 second. 2. 3. Then, a breath. It wasn't a gasp. It wasn't a cough. It was the ghost of a breath, a microscopic warm dampness against the center of my palm. So faint I wouldn't have felt it if I'd kept my glove on. But it was there. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Lord have mercy, I whispered. I kept my hand there. 10 seconds later, another faint puff of air. She was in there, trapped in the dark, shutting down, fading away, but fighting. I looked up. Thomas was standing right above me. The branch had dropped from his hands. His eyes were wide, staring at his mother's face in the dirt. I looked at him. I looked at the little girl, Eliza. I looked at the boy, Benjamin. I spoke loud enough to cut straight through the Wyoming wind. Thomas, Eliza, Benjamin. They snapped their eyes to me. Your mama is coming home with me, right now. And so are you. Dark. Heavy. That was the first thing, not the cold, just the weight of it. I didn't know where I was. I didn't know what I was. For a long time, there was just the crushing pressure against my chest, dirt in my mouth, sand grinding between my teeth. Then came the memories, jagged, like broken glass cutting into my mind. The rumble of the wagon, the bitter taste of the tea Edward handed me, his voice smooth and pious, whispering, "May God forgive you what I cannot, sister." And the sound, oh God, the sound of the soil hitting my face. I gasped. My eyes flew open. I thrashed. My hands curled into claws, scraping against blankets. Not dirt, blankets, wool, soft, warm. Easy now. Easy. A hand pressed against my shoulder. Firm, grounding. I flinched away, scrambling backward until my spine hit a solid wooden headboard. I was in a bed. A real bed. A fire popped and hissed in a stone hearth nearby. The smell of burning pine pitch filled the air. "You're above ground, child. You're safe." I blinked against the firelight. A woman sat in a chair pulled close to the bed. She was older, 50s maybe. Silver hair pulled back tight. Thick spectacles. Eyes that had seen a lot of broken things and knew how to fix them. "My name is Henrietta Whitman," she said. Her voice was steady, like a metronome. "I'm a doctor. You are in Miller's Crossing, Wyoming territory. You've been asleep for nearly 2 days." I tried to speak. My throat was raw. It felt like I'd swallowed crushed stones. "Water," I croaked. She held a tin cup to my lips. I drank greedily. The water was cool and sweet. It hurt going down, but it was the best pain I'd ever felt. It meant I was alive. "The children," I whispered, the panic rising again. "Where are they? Thomas, Eliza, Benjamin?" "They are safe," Doc Whitman said. She set the cup down. "They're in the kitchen, eating stew. Your eldest Thomas hasn't slept much. He's been standing guard at your door." I let my head fall back against the pillow. A dry sob racked my chest. Safe. They were safe. "How?" I asked. "Edward. He buried me." "He did," she said. No pity in her voice, just facts. "And a man dug you up. The man who owns this ranch. His name is Caleb Whitfield." Before she could say another word, the floorboards out in the hallway creaked. Heavy boots. A man's boots. The bedroom door swung open just a few inches. A silhouette filled the frame. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a canvas coat and holding a battered hat in his hands. He took half a step into the room. My breath caught. My heart slammed against my ribs like a trapped bird. A man. Men meant danger. Men meant quiet conversations behind closed doors. Men meant property laws and accusations and poison in a teacup. Edward was a man. Edward had smiled at me right before he put me in the ground. I didn't mean to, but I shrank back. I pulled the heavy quilt up to my chin. My hands were shaking so hard the fabric vibrated. The man, Caleb, stopped dead in his tracks. He didn't speak. He just looked at me. His face was weathered, lined with sun and wind and things I didn't know. He saw my terror. He saw the way I pressed myself into the wood of the headboard, trying to disappear. Most men would have ignored it. Most men would have stepped forward anyway, demanding gratitude. "I saved you," they would say. "You owe me." Caleb didn't. He looked at my white knuckles. Then he looked at Doc Whitman. He took a slow, deliberate step backward, out of the room, into the hall. "Ma'am," his voice was low, gravelly. I'm not going to come near you. Not now. Not ever, if you don't want. I stared at him. The firelight flickered across his face. Doc Whitman will stay with you, he continued, his voice steady through the crack in the door. Your children are safe. No one in town knows you're here. I've got a hired hand named Ned who is deaf as a post and loyal as a hound. He won't talk. You are safe in this house. He didn't ask for my name. He didn't ask for my story. I won't step foot in this room, Caleb said, until you say I can. He pulled the door shut. It clicked softly. Gone. I sat there frozen, staring at the closed wood. Then the tears came, hot and fast. I bent my knees to my chest and buried my face in them. I cried for the life I'd lost. I cried for the terror of the dirt. But mostly I cried because in the 8 months since my husband died, that was the first time a man had given me a choice. Doc Whitman didn't rush to comfort me. She let me weep. When I was finally quiet, she handed me a damp cloth. He's a good man, she said quietly. Hard, but good. I wiped my face. Why did he do it? Why did he dig? Because he heard your children crying. And because Caleb Whitfield doesn't trust the world to do the right thing. She picked up a bowl of broth from the nightstand, handed it to me. Now eat. You need strength. Whoever put you in that ground might realize their mistake. I took the bowl. My hands were still trembling, but my mind was clearing. The fog of the poison was lifting. Edward, he accused me of murder. He said he had proof. He told me if I went to trial in Boston, I would hang. He said the state would take Thomas, Eliza, and Benjamin. He offered me a way out, a long wagon ride west, a quiet disappearance. I believed him. I was so exhausted by the grief, by the lawyers, by the constant suffocating pressure of his accusations. I just wanted the kids to be safe. I didn't know his quiet disappearance meant a shallow grave under an oak tree. He told me it was sleeping medicine, I whispered to the empty room, for the anxiety, the tea. Arsenic, most likely, Doc Whitman said bluntly. Given in a small dose, enough to slow your heart to a crawl, enough to make you look dead to a layman. You're lucky he didn't give you more. You're lucky the ground was cold. I looked down at my hands. There was still dirt under my fingernails. The door opened again, but this time it wasn't heavy boots. Mama! Thomas stood there. Eliza was holding his hand. Benjamin was peeking out from behind his legs. They looked so small, so fragile. Come here, I breathed. They ran to the bed. Eliza scrambled up and buried her face in my neck, sobbing instantly. Benjamin crawled over my legs, patting my face with his little hands to make sure I was real. Thomas stayed on the floor, holding my hand tight, his small jaw locked in a fierce, angry line. The man said you were just sleeping, Benjamin babbled. But Uncle Edward said you were sleeping too. It was confusing. I'm awake now, baby. I kissed his forehead. I'm awake. Thomas looked up at me. Are we going back to Uncle Edward? No, I said. My voice was harder now. The raw gravel in it sounded like a weapon. Never. Later that night, the house went quiet. The kids fell asleep in the bed with me, tangled in the quilts. Doc Whitman dozed in the chair. I stared up at the wooden beams of the ceiling. I was in a strange house, in a territory I didn't know, with a man I had never met. I had no money, no legal standing. The world thought I was dead, or worse, a murderer on the run. But I felt my chest rise and fall. I felt the warm breath of my children against my side. I made a vow to the ceiling beams, to God, to whoever was listening. I was buried once. I will never let anyone put me in the dark again. Whatever life I had to build here, I would build it. Whatever I had to become, I would become it. Not for me, for them. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in 8 months, I slept without dreaming of falling. 3 weeks. That's how long it took for the ghost to leave my house. For 4 years, this place was just a wooden box I slept in. I'd wake up, make coffee that tasted like burnt mud, work the cattle until my back ached, and come back to the silence. Now, The house was alive. It smelled like roasted apples and real bread. There were small boots lined up by the door. There was laundry on the line, and there was noise. I stayed out of her way. That was the rule I set for myself. Sarah and the kids took the main bedroom. I moved my cot out to the tack room in the barn. She argued, of course, said it wasn't right. I told her I liked the smell of leather better than the smell of my own cooking. That ended that. But I watched them. You can't help but watch a family that fell out of the sky. Thomas was the hardest to crack. The boy was 8, but he carried himself like an old soldier. He shadowed me. Everywhere I went, he was there, 10 paces back, watching. I was out by the corral one afternoon, fixing a broken stirrup. The wind was biting, but the sun was bright. Thomas was leaning against the fence rail, whittling a stick with a dull pocket knife. He hadn't said a word in 20 minutes. I kept my eyes on the leather punch. "You're going to whittle that stick down to nothing, son." He stopped, looked at the stick, looked at me. "Mr. Whitfield," he said. His voice was too serious for his size. "Are you going to hurt my mama?" I stopped working. I set the leather punch down on the barrel. I turned and looked at him. Really looked at him. "No, Thomas, I'm not." Uncle Edward said he wouldn't hurt her either. He said he was taking us to a nice place. "Your Uncle Edward is a liar," I said flatly. I didn't believe in sugarcoating things for kids. The world doesn't sugarcoat things. "I understand why you don't trust me. I don't expect you to." I walked over to the fence. I squatted down so I was eye level with him. "You keep watching me, Thomas, every day. You watch how I talk to her. You watch how I treat you. And if I ever do anything that scares you, anything at all, you come tell me, and I will leave." He frowned. "This is your house." "It's just wood and nails, son. I can sleep anywhere. You keep watching. You be the guard." He stared at me for a long time. Then he gave a tiny, sharp nod. He went back to whittling. We had an understanding. Eliza was different. Eliza talked enough for the both of them. She was 6, missing a front tooth, and had an imagination that ran a mile a minute. She'd sit out by the chicken coop and tell stories to the hens like they were a paying audience. I was carrying firewood one morning and caught the end of one of her tales. "And so," Eliza said solemnly to a red hen, "the first mama went to sleep and went up to the sky, and the babies cried and cried. Then the second mama came. She didn't know how to be a mama at first. She burned the toast, but then she learned. And the babies loved the second mama more than anything, but they couldn't tell the mean uncle that because the mean uncle said the second mama wasn't real." I stopped dead in my tracks. The firewood suddenly felt heavy. I looked over at the porch. Sarah was there, scrubbing clothes in a tin tub. Her sleeves were rolled up. Her dark hair was falling out of its pins. She looked exhausted, but she was smiling at Benjamin, who was trying to eat a handful of snow. The second mama. I carried the wood inside, but my mind was spinning. That night, the house was quiet. The kids were asleep in the back room. I was sitting at the kitchen table, oiling my revolver by the light of a kerosene lamp. Sarah was across the room, sitting by the fire, mending a tear in one of Thomas's coats. We didn't talk much in the evenings. We didn't need to. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was comfortable. But tonight the silence broke. "Mr. Whitfield?" I looked up. She had put the needle down. Her hands were folded in her lap. She was looking at the fire, not at me. "I heard Eliza talking to you today," she said. Her voice was quiet, brittle. "About the first mama and the second mama." "She was talking to the chickens, ma'am. I just happened to be walking by." Sarah finally turned to look at me. Her gray eyes were wide, dark in the dim light. "I have to tell you the truth, Caleb. Because if we are going to stay under your roof, you need to know who you are sheltering." I set the rag down. "You don't owe me a story, Sarah." "I do." She took a breath. "Thomas, Eliza, and Benjamin. They are not my children, not by blood." I didn't say anything, I just waited. "Jonathan Holland was a widower," she continued. "His first wife, Margaret, died of consumption. Thomas was 2. Eliza was barely 6 months old, and Margaret was pregnant with Benjamin. She lived just long enough to deliver him. Then she was gone. Sarah looked down at her hands. I was 23. I had no family. My brother died in the war. My parents were gone. I was alone in Boston. Jonathan hired me as a governess. That was all I was, a hired girl to keep the children alive because he was too broken by grief to do it himself. She smiled, but it was a sad, hollow thing. Thomas wouldn't speak. Eliza screamed every night. Benjamin was a newborn who needed constant care. But I loved them. God help me, I loved them instantly. I poured everything I had into those 3 babies. Her voice thickened. 2 years later, Jonathan asked me to marry him. It wasn't a grand romance at first, it was practical. The children called me Mama. He didn't want to confuse them. He didn't want to risk me leaving. We grew to care for each other deeply, but the kids, they were the foundation. She looked back up at me. There was a fierce defensive fire in her eyes now. When Jonathan died, his brother Edward stepped in. Edward said I had no legal claim to the estate. That was fine. I didn't care about the money, but then he said I had no legal claim to the children. I was just a stepmother, a glorified servant. He was the blood uncle. He was taking them. Her breath hitched. He told me he'd take them away, send them to boarding schools, and I would never see them again, unless I went away with him, to a place out west. He said if I disappeared quietly, he would let us stay together. I knew he was going to kill me, I knew it. But if I stayed in Boston, he would have taken them that day. She wiped a tear off her cheek, angry at herself for crying. I am not their real mother, Caleb. That's what Edward told me. That's what the law says. I am just a woman who took someone else's children. She waited, bracing for it, bracing for me to agree with the law, bracing for me to tell her she was a fraud. I picked up my revolver. I checked the cylinder. I set it down. I looked at her. Sarah. She flinched at her name. My wife, Mary, I said slowly. We wanted kids. We wanted a house full of them. We tried for 5 years. When she finally got pregnant, we thought it was a miracle. But the baby came too early. It tore her apart. They both died on a Tuesday morning in that bedroom you're sleeping in. Sarah's breath caught. Caleb. I didn't know. I thought I'd never understand what it meant to be a father, I said, ignoring her apology. I pointed a finger toward the back room. But I've been watching you for 3 weeks. I watched you sit up for 2 straight nights when Benjamin had a fever. I watch how Thomas looks to you before he decides if a room is safe. I stood up from the table. I walked over to the fire. Blood is an accident, Sarah. Any fool can make a child. But what you do, waking up every day, choosing to love them, choosing to get into a wagon with a man you knew was going to kill you just to buy them a few more days together? I looked her dead in the eye. That makes you more of a mother than anyone I've ever met. The law in Boston doesn't mean a damn thing in Wyoming. They are your kids, and you are their mother. Sarah stared at me. Her lip trembled. She covered her mouth with her hand. The defensive wall she had built around herself just shattered. She wept, silently, shoulders shaking. I didn't step forward. I didn't hug her. That wasn't my place. I just stood there, tending the fire, letting her know she didn't have to fight me. Suddenly, the kitchen door banged open. We both jumped. Benjamin stood there in his nightshirt, barefoot on the cold floor. He had one hand clamped tight over the pocket of his shirt. Benjamin, what are you doing out of bed? Sarah asked, hastily wiping her face. I found a friend, the 4-year-old announced. He opened his hand. A massive, slimy green bullfrog leaped out of his pocket and landed squarely on my polished boot. Sarah gasped. I looked down at the frog. The frog looked up at me. And then Sarah laughed. It started as a choke, then bubbled up into a real, honest-to-God laugh. A sound like bells ringing in an empty church. Benjamin giggled and chased the frog under the table. I stood there watching her laugh. And for a second, just a second, I swore I felt a draft of warm air brush past my shoulder. This house was built for a family, Caleb. I could almost hear Mary whisper it. Don't you ever let it be anything less. I smiled. The first real smile in 4 years. "All right, Ben," I said, getting down on my hands and knees. "Let's catch your friend before he finds my boots again. You never really get all the dirt out." I scrubbed my hands with lye soap until the knuckles bled. I washed my hair 3 times in the tin basin, but every time I closed my eyes, I could still taste the grit. I could still smell the damp, rotting roots. It had been 4 weeks since Caleb Whitfield pulled me out of the ground. My body was healing. The bruises from where I had clawed blindly at the earth were fading to a dull yellow. But my mind was stuck somewhere between the oak tree and the bedroom door. I couldn't just sit. If I sat, the walls started closing in, so I worked. I took over the cooking. Caleb's pantry was nothing but flour, salted pork, and dried beans. Food meant for a man who ate just to keep his heart beating. I found some dried apples Hannah Kellerman had sent over. I baked a pie. I scrubbed the floors. I mended his work shirts, the ones with collars frayed down to the threads. I needed to be useful. If I was useful, I wasn't a burden. If I wasn't a burden, maybe he wouldn't realize what a massive risk he had taken by bringing me here. He caught me one morning aggressively scrubbing a cast iron skillet that was already clean. "You're going to scrub the iron right off that pan, ma'am," he said. He was standing in the doorway, snow on his boots, a blast of cold air rolling off his coat. I stopped. My shoulders were tight. "I want to earn our keep, Mr. Whitfield." He frowned. Not angry, just troubled. "You don't owe me a wage. You're guests." "We are fugitives," I corrected him. He didn't argue. He just took his hat off and hung it on the peg. "Ned brought some fresh milk from the cow. Leave the skillet." Later that afternoon, the sun broke through the gray clouds. The snow on the plains glittered like crushed glass. I found Caleb out by the barn chopping firewood. The rhythmic thwack of the axe was steady, hypnotic. I walked up to him. I pulled my shawl tighter around my shoulders. "Take me back to it," I said. He stopped mid-swing. He rested the axe head on the chopping block. He didn't ask what I meant. He knew. "That's not a good idea, Sarah." It was the first time he used my given name. It slipped out, natural. I need to see it. I need to know it's real, that I didn't just dream the whole thing up in a fever. He looked at me for a long time, measuring my strength. Then he nodded. We rode out in his buckboard wagon. The kids were inside with Doc Whitman, who had come by to drop off some cough syrup for Eliza. Caleb didn't speak during the ride. He just held the reins, his eyes scanning the horizon. We reached the river bend, the lone oak tree. I climbed down before he could help me. My boots crunched in the snow. I walked toward the mound. It was still there, but it was different. The hole had been filled in neatly. The dirt was patted down, and at the head of the grave, the makeshift sticks were gone. In their place was a solid wooden cross carved from pine. I stepped closer. Burned into the wood were the words, "An unknown traveler. Saved by grace. October 1882. I stared at the letters. The wind whipped my hair across my face. "You made this?" I asked. My voice was hollow. Caleb walked up beside me. "I did." "Why?" "I'm not in there, because the woman you were before you got here. Some part of her did die in that ground. I figured she deserved to be remembered. Kept the grave from looking like a crime scene, too." I fell to my knees. The snow soaked through my heavy wool skirt. I rested my hand on the frozen dirt. "I was going to let him do it," I whispered. Caleb didn't move. He just listened. When Edward put me in the wagon in Boston, I knew. Deep down, I knew what the faraway place meant. But I was so tired, Caleb. Jonathan was dead. The lawyers were circling like vultures. Edward was threatening to take the children to an orphanage in London. I was just done. I looked up at him. The tears were freezing on my cheeks. When he handed me the tea, I knew it tasted wrong. It tasted like ash and copper. But I drank it. I thought, at least the children will be safe. At least I can rest. My soul surrendered. I let go. I looked back down at my hands, at the faint scratches still visible on my wrists. But the moment I felt the dirt hit my face, the moment the air ran out, I fought. I don't even remember doing it. I just woke up in your bed with my fingernails torn to the quick. My mind wanted to die. But my body... I let out a broken sob. My body refused. It clawed its way back. It insisted on living. It's a terrifying thing, Caleb. Finding out your body wants to live more than you do. Caleb knelt down next to me. He didn't touch me. He just occupied the space beside me. That's what bodies do, Sarah. They know things we forget. They know that the sun is going to come up tomorrow. They know that breathing is better than not breathing. There's no shame in surviving. The only shame is on the man who put you here. He stood up. He offered me his hand. Come on, it's getting cold. Let's go home. Home. The word felt strange, dangerous. But I took his hand. His palm was rough, calloused, and entirely steady. That night, after the children were asleep, I sat by the fire with a piece of parchment and a charcoal pencil. I needed to write to Henry Abernathy. He was Jonathan's lawyer. An old friend. If anyone in Boston could prove my innocence, it was him. If anyone could find the fake will Edward had undoubtedly filed, it was Henry. I wrote 3 lines. Henry, I am alive. Edward tried to murder me. I am in Wyoming. I stared at the words. If I sent this, Edward might intercept it, or he might have Henry followed. He would send men, real men. Men with guns and badges bought with my husband's money. They would come to this house. They would bring violence to Caleb's door. I couldn't do it. I crumpled the parchment. I tossed it into the flames. It flared up bright orange, then turned to black ash. Who were you writing to? I jumped. Caleb had come in from the cold. He was holding an armful of split logs. No one, I said quickly, just writing down a recipe. I messed it up. He dropped the logs into the iron bin. He looked at the ashes. He looked at me. You're a terrible liar, Sarah. It's better this way, I said, my voice rising. If I reach out, he'll find me. He'll find us. He'll hurt you. You have done enough for us. I won't bring a murderer to your doorstep. Caleb dusted the bark off his coat. He walked over to my chair. He leaned down, resting his hands on the armrests, trapping me in his gaze. Listen to me. I dug you out of the ground. That wasn't a favor. That was a pact, whether either of us wanted it or not. You don't get to decide what I can and can't handle. If you need to fight a war in Boston, you tell me, and I'll saddle the horses. You don't owe me anything, I cried. It's not about owing, he said fiercely. It's about finishing what we started. He stood up, walked into the kitchen, left me breathless by the fire. Later, in the dark of the bedroom, I felt a small hand tug on my blanket. It was Thomas. Mama? I'm here, baby. What is it, bad dream? He climbed into the bed, curling up against my side. He smelled like lye soap and wood smoke. Are we going to stay here forever? He whispered. I stroked his hair. I don't know, Thomas. This isn't our house. He was quiet for a minute, listening to the wind rattle the window panes. I want to stay, he said softly. Why? You miss Boston. You miss your room. I don't miss Uncle Edward. Uncle Edward looked at us like we were math problems he couldn't solve. Mr. Caleb... Thomas yawned, his eyes drooping shut. Mr. Caleb looks at us like we're people. I held him tight in the dark. I closed my eyes. And for the first time since Jonathan died, I didn't pray for it to be over. I prayed for the strength to fight back. November hit Miller's Crossing like a swung fist. The snow came down in thick, blinding sheets. We were snowed in for 5 days straight. It was the kind of weather that usually drove a man crazy, staring at the same 4 walls. But I didn't mind it, not this year. The house was warm. Sarah had a way of moving through the rooms that made them feel bigger. lighter. The kids were getting loud. Benjamin chased the barn cat. Eliza sang songs. Thomas actually smiled when I let him help me oil the saddles. It was a family, a borrowed one, sure, but it felt right. I wrote in my ledger every night. Tally of feed, tally of cattle. And at the bottom of the page, a warning to myself. This cannot last. The world is going to come looking for her. You need to be ready. By the end of the second week of November, the pantry was running dangerously low. We needed flour, sugar, coffee, and ammunition. I couldn't put off a trip into town any longer. I hitched the wagon. Sarah came out onto the porch, wrapped in a heavy wool shawl. "I'm going with you," she said. I stopped tightening the harness. "No, you're not. I haven't left this property in a month and a half, Caleb. I'm going." "Sarah, if Edward has people looking for you, I will wear a veil. I will wear Doc Whitman's old hat. I'll stay in the wagon." "But I have to see the sky, Caleb. I have to know the world is still out there." She had that look in her eye, the one that told me I could either agree or she'd walk the 10 miles to town in the snow. I sighed. Get in. We left the kids with Doc Whitman. The ride into town was rough. The ruts in the road were frozen solid. Sarah sat close to me on the bench, shivering despite the blankets. Miller's Crossing wasn't much to look at. A bank, a saloon, a post office, and Hannah Kellerman's general store. I pulled the wagon up to the boardwalk in front of Hannah's. "Stay here," I told Sarah. "Keep your head down." She nodded, pulling the wide-brimmed hat lower over her face. I went inside. The bell above the door jingled. It smelled like peppermint, oiled leather, and chewing tobacco. Hannah was behind the counter counting out change for old man Higgins. Hannah was 38, a widow herself, and had raised 4 boys on her own. She had eyes like a hawk and a tongue like a razor strop. "Caleb Whitfield," she said, looking up. "I thought you froze to death out there. Haven't seen you in a month." "Takes more than a little snow to kill me, Hannah. Need my usual order, and double the flour." Hannah raised an eyebrow. "Double? You taking up competitive baking out there in the sticks?" "Just hungry." She didn't buy it, but she didn't push it. She went to the back to fill the sacks. I walked over to the dry goods barrel. I glanced out the frosted window. Sarah was still on the wagon bench, but Hannah had walked back to the counter carrying a sack of sugar. Hannah looked out the window. She saw the silhouette on the wagon. She set the sugar down. Slow. "Caleb?" "Yeah?" "I don't know who you've got sitting on that wagon out there," Hannah said. Her voice dropped. Quiet. Private. "And I don't want to know. It's none of my business." I went rigid. I didn't turn around. "But," Hannah continued, "I've been watching you come in here for 4 years, buying supplies for one, looking like a ghost haunting his own life. Today, you bought peppermint sticks. You haven't bought peppermint since Mary died." I finally turned to look at her. Hannah's eyes were soft. "Whoever she is, whatever she's running from, you protect her, but don't let her break you. You're a good man, Caleb. Just ring up the flour, Hannah." I loaded the supplies into the back of the wagon, tossed a heavy tarp over the sacks. We rode back to the ranch in silence. The snow was starting to fall again, fat white flakes sticking to the horses' manes. When we got back, the kids ran out to greet us. Sarah took the peppermint sticks inside, her face lit up with a genuine smile. I unhitched the horses and brought the supplies into the kitchen. Sarah was unboxing the dry goods. Hannah always used old newspapers to wrap the glass jars of preserves to keep them from breaking on the bumpy ride. I was tossing logs onto the fire when I heard a sharp intake of breath, like someone had just been punched in the stomach. I turned around. Sarah was standing by the table. She was holding a piece of wrinkled newspaper. The ink was rubbing off on her fingers. Her face was entirely drained of color. "Sarah?" I stepped forward. She didn't look at me. Her eyes were locked on the page. She was trembling so violently the paper rattled. I walked over. I gently took the paper from her hands. It was the Boston Daily Tribune, dated late August, roughly a week after she was buried. There was a drawing on the front page, a sketch of a woman with dark hair and striking eyes. It was her. Above the picture in thick black type, "Wanted." Information on the disappearance of Sarah Holland, suspect in the murder of Jonathan Holland. Below it, the text was vicious. It claimed she had purchased arsenic, that she had slowly poisoned her wealthy husband, that she had kidnapped the heirs to the estate and vanished. There was a $500 reward for her capture. I read it twice. I looked at Sarah. She was holding onto the edge of the kitchen table, her knuckles white. She looked like she was about to faint. "Sarah," I said. My voice was steady. "Look at me." She shook her head. "He did it. He really did it. He planned the whole thing. The poison, the grave, the papers. If I show my face anywhere, they'll hang me. I don't believe a word printed on this page." "You barely know me, Caleb," she snapped, finally looking up. There were tears in her eyes, but underneath them was a profound, suffocating terror. "I could be exactly what they say I am." "I've watched you for a month and a half," I said, stepping closer. "I watched you sew a patch onto an orphan boy's coat. I watched you stay awake all night to keep a fire going so your daughter wouldn't cough. Women who poison their husbands for money don't love his children like that. Guilt doesn't look like you." She stared at me, her chest heaving. And then something happened. The panic in her eyes vanished. It didn't fade. It snapped off, like a lantern blown out in the wind. She straightened her spine. She let go of the table. She wiped the tears from her face with the back of her sleeve. When she looked at me again, her eyes were like flint, cold, hard, sharp enough to cut glass. "You're right," she said. Her voice didn't shake at all. I frowned. I took a half step back. "Sarah, I need to tell you the truth, Caleb, and you need to sit down." I didn't sit. I crossed my arms. "I remember everything," she said flatly. "What do you mean?" "The memory loss, the confusion, the fog I've been in since you pulled me out of the dirt. It was a lie." I felt a cold prickle at the base of my neck. "You lied to Doc Whitman? To me?" "I had to," she said. She walked over to the fire, turning her back to me. "I remember the tea. I remember the wagon ride. I remember waking up in the coffin. I remember clawing at the wood until my nails broke. I remember screaming until my vocal cords bled. I remember hearing my children crying above me and knowing I couldn't reach them." She turned back to face me. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was a strategist, a survivor who had been playing a very long, very dangerous game. "A woman who remembers her own burial is a dangerous woman, Caleb. A woman seeking revenge is a liability. I needed you to think I was broken. I needed Doc Whitman to think I was confused." "Why?" I demanded, anger flaring hot in my chest. "Not because she lied, because she didn't trust me. Because if Edward's men ever found us," she said, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper, "I needed you to be completely off your guard. I needed you to view me as a pity case. Because if they came, I was going to leave in the middle of the night. I was going to surrender to them to keep you and the children safe. And if you thought I was a helpless victim, you wouldn't be prepared to stop me." I stared at her. This woman had orchestrated her own emotional helplessness day after day, so that when the time came, she could sacrifice herself without anyone standing in her way. "You foolish, arrogant woman," I said. She flinched. I closed the distance between us. I didn't touch her, but I stood close enough that she had to look up at me. "You thought you were protecting me?" I asked, my voice low and vibrating with anger. "You thought you had the right to make that decision for me? I won't let you die for my mistakes." "They aren't your mistakes," I roared. The shout echoed in the small kitchen. "You didn't do this, and you don't get to die in the dirt quietly just to keep my hands clean." She stared up at me, her chest rising and falling fast. "I have been protecting you since the minute I saw that grave," I told her, "without your permission. And you have been protecting me without mine. Well, the game is over, Sarah, right now." I grabbed the newspaper off the table. I walked over to the hearth and threw it directly into the flames. We both watched it burn. The sketched face of the wanted woman turning to black soot. I turned back to her. If Edward comes, he comes. If the law comes, they come. But you aren't running, and you aren't surrendering. We face them right here, together." She looked at the fire. Then she looked at me. The hardness in her eyes finally cracked, letting the real, exhausted woman shine through. "Okay, Caleb," she whispered. "Okay." I let out a long breath. Tomorrow I go back to town. I send a telegram to Henry Abernathy. We start the fire. Thanksgiving came to Wyoming like a quiet apology. The wind stopped howling for a few days. The sky cleared. It turned a sharp, freezing blue. You could see the mountains cutting into the horizon. For the first time in my life, I had something to be thankful for that wasn't just survival. I wanted to make a proper dinner. It felt important. I used the flour Caleb bought. I found a jar of wild raspberries Hannah Kellerman had sent. I made a tart. Caleb managed to shoot a wild turkey out by the tree line. The house smelled like roasting meat and sage. Doc Whitman came by in the early afternoon. Pastor Grant rode out too. Caleb had invited him, said any man eating alone on Thanksgiving was just chewing on his own sorrow. Even old Ned showed up. He stood by the door with his hat in his hands, refusing to come further into the parlor. I had to physically pull him to the table. It was loud. It was chaotic. The children laughed. Doc Whitman told a story about a stubborn mule. Caleb smiled. He didn't say much, but he smiled. Pastor Grant caught my eye across the table. He raised his glass of cider. Just a fraction of an inch. A silent blessing. I felt a lump in my throat. I swallowed it down with the cider. After dinner, the house settled. The children fell asleep in a pile by the hearth, exhausted from playing in the snow. Doc Whitman was dozing in the rocking chair. Old Ned had gone back to the bunkhouse. Pastor Grant had ridden back to town before the sun dropped. I was at the sink, washing the plates in a tin basin. The water was hot. The soap smelled like pine. Caleb walked up beside me. He picked up a linen cloth. He didn't ask. He just started drying the plates I set on the counter. We stood close. The kitchen was small. There wasn't much room to maneuver. I could feel the heat radiating off his wool shirt. I could hear his steady breathing. I washed a heavy ceramic plate. I handed it to him. My fingers brushed his. I didn't pull back, neither did he. 1 second, 2, 3. The water dripped into the basin. The fire cracked in the other room. His hand was warm, calloused, solid. I slowly pulled my hand away. I didn't look at him. I kept my eyes on the soapy water. "Sarah," he said quietly. "I know, Caleb. It's not the right time." "I know," I repeated. I scrubbed a fork. "But it's not the wrong time forever." I handed him the fork. He took it. He dried it. We finished the dishes in silence. But it wasn't the heavy silence of strangers anymore. It was the silence of two people who had decided to wait. 2 days later, the peace shattered. Caleb had gone into town to check the mail at the post office. He came back just as a new blizzard started blowing in. He didn't bother taking off his snowy coat. He walked straight into the kitchen. His face was hard, like granite. He pulled a thick envelope from his inner pocket. He handed it to me. "It was addressed to me," Caleb said. His voice was grim. "But the postmark is Boston." My stomach dropped. I wiped my hands on my apron. I took the envelope. I tore it open. There was a letter inside. The handwriting belonged to Henry Abernathy, my husband's lawyer, the only man in Boston I trusted. To Mr. C. Whitfield, the letter began. "My name is Henry Abernathy. I am an attorney. I am writing to you because I have reason to believe you know the whereabouts of a Mrs. Sarah Holland. She has been missing since August." I stopped reading. I looked at Caleb. "He knows." "Keep reading," Caleb said. "I am not writing on behalf of the authorities. I believe Mrs. Holland is entirely innocent of the terrible charges against her. I have been quietly gathering evidence to prove it. If she is alive, and my wife has prayed every night that she is, please tell her she has a friend here. But she must move quickly." The handwriting grew hurried, messy. Edward Holland has hired a private investigator. His name is Thaddeus Gale. Mr. Gale is ruthless. He is not a lawman. He is a bounty hunter in a fine suit. He is closing in on the Western Territories. If Mrs. Holland wishes to fight, she must contact me immediately through my wife's maiden address provided below. I lowered the letter. The paper trembled in my hands. Thaddeus Gale, I whispered. I've heard Edward talk about him. He used him once to intimidate a rival businessman. He breaks people, Caleb. He's not breaking anyone here. If Abernathy believes I'm innocent, it means he has proof. But it also means Edward knows time is running out. He'll push Gale to find me faster. Then we write back. Caleb pulled out a chair. He pointed to it. Sit down. We write back right now. Caleb, if we send a letter, they might trace it. If we don't send a letter, we hide in this cabin for the rest of our lives. The kids never go to school. You never walk into town without a veil. I won't let you live like a ghost. I looked at him. He was right. I sat down. He brought me paper and ink. We wrote the letter together. I detailed everything. The tea, the wagon ride, the fact that Jonathan had told me he changed his will 2 weeks before he died, but Edward had produced an older version. Caleb added a note at the bottom, detailing exactly where we were and stating that any man who came looking for trouble would find it. We sealed it. Caleb gave it to Doc Whitman the next morning. She was taking the train to Cheyenne for medical supplies. She would mail it from there, 300 miles away, to throw off the trail. That night, the blizzard hit with full force. The wind screamed around the eaves. The timber groaned. I sat by the hearth. The kids were asleep. Caleb was sitting on the sofa, polishing his rifle. I moved from my chair. I sat on the sofa, right next to him. He stopped polishing. He didn't look at me, but I saw his jaw tighten. Caleb, I said softly, do you believe in God? He stared into the fire. He thought about it. I believe in something, he said finally. I don't know if God is the right name for it. Seen too much bad happen to good people to believe there's an old man in the clouds keeping a fair ledger. I used to believe, I said. I pulled my knees up to my chest. Then Jonathan died. Then Edward accused me. Then the dirt hit my face. I thought I lost God in that grave. And now? I looked at his profile, the strong nose, the rough beard. Now I think, if God exists, he sent a rancher out to fix a broken fence on the exact day at the exact hour to hear 3 kids crying. That wasn't an accident. Caleb finally turned his head. He looked at me. His eyes were dark in the firelight. Sarah, he said deadpan. I went out to that fence line because a stubborn heifer broke through the wire. Not because of God. I smiled, a real smile. Maybe the cow was God. Caleb stared at me for a second. Then a low chuckle started in his chest. It grew. He threw his head back and laughed. I laughed with him. We sat there, laughing in the middle of a blizzard with a bounty hunter on the way. It was the laughter of people who had been through hell and found the humor on the other side. I rested my head against his shoulder. He didn't pull away. He just let me rest. December. The snow was deep, waist-high in the drifts. We were holed up tight. I had chopped enough wood to last till spring. The cellar was full. I kept my Colt Navy Point .36 on my hip from the minute I put my boots on till the minute I took them off. It was a Tuesday morning when the warning came. I was in the barn, pitching hay. The barn doors were cracked open to let the horses breathe. I heard the crunch of hooves on packed snow. Hard riding. Fast. I dropped the pitchfork. My hand went to the iron at my waist. It was old Ned. His horse was lathered, steam rolling off its flanks in the freezing air. Ned practically fell out of the saddle. He was breathing hard. Caleb, he wheezed. Town. Catch your breath, Ned. What is it? Stranger in town. Rode in on the morning stagecoach, wearing a bowler hat and a heavy eastern coat. Ned pointed a shaking finger back toward Miller's Crossing. He's asking questions, offering silver dollars for answers. My blood ran cold. What kind of questions? Asking about a woman. Dark hair, traveling with 3 small children. He's got a sketch, showing it to everyone in the saloon, showing it at the general store. Did Hannah say anything? Hannah told him she hadn't seen a damn thing, told him to buy a tin of coffee or get out of her store. Ned wiped his nose with his sleeve. But Pastor Grant was coming out of the post office when the man was asking around. The stranger, he's sharp, Caleb. He's watching people's eyes when he asks, not just listening to their words. What's his name? Said his name was Gale, Thaddeus Gale. All right, I nodded. Ned, go to the bunkhouse, get your Winchester, load it. Don't come out unless you hear shooting. Ned's eyes went wide, but he didn't argue. He hurried off. I ran to the house. I didn't bother wiping my boots. Sarah was at the stove stirring porridge. She saw my face. She dropped the spoon. He's here, I said. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. The survivor in her just clicked into place. Kids, she said sharply. Thomas, Eliza, and Benjamin looked up from the table. We are playing the hiding game, Sarah said. Her voice was totally calm. Into the cellar, now. Thomas, take the lantern. Do not light it unless it is completely dark. Do not make a sound, understand? Thomas nodded. He grabbed his sister's hand and herded his little brother toward the trapdoor in the pantry. Sarah ushered them down the wooden stairs. She closed the heavy oak door. She pulled a rug over it. I walked into the bedroom. I opened the locked chest at the foot of the bed. I pulled out Mary's old Derringer. It was small, 2 shots. But at close range, it would stop a man dead. I walked back to the kitchen. I handed it to Sarah. I taught you how to shoot, I said. You remember? She took the heavy little gun. She checked the hammer. Point and pull. You stay in the bedroom. Keep the door closed. If anyone opens that door and it isn't me, you put a hole in his chest. You don't warn him. You don't ask questions. You shoot. Caleb, she grabbed my arm. He is an investigator. He doesn't have a warrant, but he has money. He can hire thugs. He's not getting past the gate. I stepped out onto the front porch. I pulled my coat tight against the wind. I stood there and waited. It took an hour. Around 2 o'clock, the wind died down. Through the bare trees, I saw movement. A single rider coming up the trail from town. He rode a rented livery horse. He wore a heavy black overcoat and a bowler hat. He looked entirely out of place in Wyoming, like a raven in a flock of sparrows. He stopped his horse at my front gate, about 20 yards from the porch. I stood on the top step. I didn't rest my hand on my gun. I just let it hang loose by my side. Mr. Whitfield, the man called out. His voice was smooth, educated, Boston polish. Who's asking? My name is Thaddeus Gale. He tipped his hat, a polite gesture from a dangerous man. I am a private investigator. I've come a very long way from Massachusetts. I was hoping I might have a word. You can have one, I said, from right there. He smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. He dismounted slowly. He tied the horse to the fence post. He stepped up to the gate, resting his gloved hands on the top rail. I'm looking for a woman, Gale said. Sarah Holland. She is a fugitive from justice, wanted for the murder of her husband by poison. She is traveling with 3 kidnapped children. There is a substantial reward for her recovery. Haven't seen her. Gale chuckled. A dry, rattling sound. Mr. Whitfield, I have been doing this job for 15 years. I know the look of a man who is lying. I know the shape of a town that is keeping a secret. The good people of Miller's Crossing were remarkably hostile to my inquiries today. Maybe they just don't like Easterners. Perhaps. Gale leaned forward against the gate. But let me offer you a piece of advice. The woman you are protecting is a killer. She poisoned a good man for his money. If she did it once, she will do it again. You have property. You have a ranch. Don't throw your life away for a black widow. I felt the anger burn hot in my chest, but I kept my face blank. Mr. Gale, I said. My voice carried over the snow. I'll tell you what I know about 15 years of experience. I was a field medic at Gettysburg. I saw officers frame privates for desertion to cover their own blunders. I saw men steal boots off the dying. I learned one thing in that war. Gale stopped smiling. The man screaming the loudest accusation, I continued, is usually the man trying to hide his own guilt. Whoever hired you. I wouldn't trust him to tell me the time of day. Gale's eyes narrowed. I have evidence, Mr. Whitfield. Then take it to a judge, take it to a federal marshal, get a real warrant. Because until a man with a tin star tells me otherwise, you are just a trespasser. I took one step down the stairs. Get off my land! Gale stared at me. He calculated the distance. He calculated the odds. He saw my hand hovering near my hip. He wasn't a fool. He was a survivor, too. Very well, Gale said. He tipped his hat again. But I have nowhere else to be, Mr. Whitfield. I can be very patient. He got back on his horse. He didn't ride back to town. He rode down the fence line. He stopped on a patch of public land just past my property marker. He dismounted. He started building a campfire. He was laying siege. I went back inside. I bolted the door. Sarah was standing in the hallway, holding the derringer. I heard him. He's camped out past the property line. He's watching the house. That evening, Pastor Grant rode out. He didn't come up the main road. He came through the backwoods, tying his horse behind the barn. He knocked on the back door. I let him in. Caleb, the pastor said, shaking snow off his coat. The town is buzzing. Gale offered Jebediah Carter $50 for information. You know Jebediah hates you over that land dispute 3 years ago. He might talk. Let him, I said. Gale still doesn't have a warrant. Pastor Grant looked at Sarah. She was pouring him a cup of coffee. Her hands were perfectly steady. Ma'am, the pastor said gently, I know an innocent soul when I see one. You prayed with me on Thanksgiving. The words you spoke, a killer doesn't talk to God like that. You were mourning a real loss. Thank you, Pastor, Sarah whispered. The town will hold quiet for a few days, he told us. Hannah Kellerman threatened to cut off the credit of anyone who speaks to the man in the bowler hat, but money makes men weak. You need to be ready. Pastor Grant left the same way he came. That night, I sat by the front window. The lamps were out. The house was pitch black. I watched the orange glow of Gale's campfire out on the plains. I held my rifle across my lap. Around midnight, I heard soft footsteps. Sarah walked into the parlor. She was wearing a heavy shawl over her nightgown. She didn't ask if I needed anything. She just brought a blanket. She sat down in the chair next to mine. She draped the blanket over both of our laps. You should sleep, I told her. No. We sat in the dark, watching the fire out in the snow. Caleb, she said softly, tomorrow you need to go to town. You need to send a telegram to Abernathy. Tell him Gale is here. Tell him to move faster. I will. And I'm going to write a letter to the children. Her voice finally cracked, just a little. In case he gets past you, in case he gets me, I need them to know the truth. I turned my head. I looked at her in the shadows. He's not getting past me, Sarah. I need to write it, Caleb. Let me have this. I nodded slowly. All right. Write it. She leaned over. She rested her head on my shoulder. It was the first time she had initiated contact like that. Deliberate. Seeking comfort. Seeking me. I didn't move. I didn't put my arm around her. I just stayed perfectly still, letting her use me as an anchor. Thank you, she whispered into the dark, for not believing him today. I didn't need to disbelieve him, I said quietly. I already know you. I've known everything I need to know since the day I dug you out. We sat there, watching the enemy's fire burn against the Wyoming winter, waiting for the dawn. 3 days. That's how long Thaddeus Gale sat out on the frozen prairie. A black smudge against the white snow. He built a fire, he smoked his cigars, he just watched the house, waiting for us to break. He didn't know Caleb Whitfield, but the waiting gnawed at me. I couldn't sleep. Every time the wind rattled the window panes, my heart jumped into my throat. Caleb slipped out on the 4th night. He took the back trail through the pines. No horse, just snowshoes. He went to town to send the wire to Abernathy and to pick up whatever mail Doc Whitman had managed to smuggle back from Cheyenne. I paced the floor until dawn. When the back door finally clicked open, I nearly dropped the iron poker. Caleb stepped inside. He was covered in frost. His beard was white with it. He locked the door behind him and pulled a crumpled telegram and a thick letter from his coat. He handed them to me. His hands were freezing. "The telegram is from Henry," Caleb said, his voice a low rasp. "It's short. He says he's coming. He'll be in Miller's Crossing by the end of the month." I set the telegram down. I looked at the letter. It was addressed to me. The handwriting wasn't Henry's. It was elegant, slanted. It was from Eleanor, Henry's wife. My hands shook as I broke the wax seal. I unfolded the heavy parchment. I moved closer to the kerosene lamp. Caleb stood by the stove, watching my face. "Sarah, my dearest friend," the letter read. "Henry is doing everything the law allows, but you must know what we are up against. Edward is not just using rumors. He has a paper trail." I swallowed hard. My throat felt like sandpaper. Edward produced a receipt from a pharmacy on Tremont Street. It is dated 3 days before Jonathan passed. It is a receipt for arsenic. It has your signature on it, Sarah. The apothecary owner swore an affidavit. He said a woman matching your description bought it. He said she used your name. I stopped reading. The words blurred into black streaks. I dropped the letter onto the table. I backed away. "Sarah?" Caleb stepped toward me. "What does it say?" "He has proof," I whispered. My chest tightened. I couldn't pull enough air into my lungs. "He actually has proof, Caleb." "What kind of proof?" "A receipt for the poison with my name on it." Caleb frowned. "Did you buy it?" "No, of course not." I grabbed the edge of the counter. My head was spinning. But I was there, 3 days before Jonathan died. I took Eliza to the doctor. The clinic is on Tremont Street. I walked right past that pharmacy. I pressed my hands against my temples. The trap was so perfect, so seamless. "Someone must have seen me," I said, my voice rising, bordering on hysteria. "Edward must have had someone following me. They waited until I was on that street. They went in. They bought the poison using my name. Or he paid the apothecary to lie." I looked at Caleb. The panic was taking over. "It's a noose, Caleb. He built a perfect noose. If I go back to Boston, a jury will look at that receipt. They'll look at the apothecary and they will hang me." Caleb didn't flinch. He didn't panic. He just walked over to the table, picked up the letter, and read it himself. "An apothecary owner can be bought," Caleb said flatly. "A signature can be forged. This is just paper, Sarah. It's enough paper to kill me." "Then we find better paper." He set the letter down. He looked at me, hard, grounding me. "Henry is coming. He's a smart man. He wouldn't travel across the country if he thought this was over. We hold the line." He went to the stove to make coffee. I sat down at the table. I buried my face in my hands. The house was quiet. The wind had finally died down. Then I heard a sound, a soft shuffle of bare feet on the wooden floor. I looked up. Thomas was standing in the doorway to the hall. He was wearing his oversized nightshirt. He was clutching a ragged wool blanket to his chest. He looked so small, so terribly young. "Thomas," I said, wiping my eyes quickly, "you should be in bed, baby. It's freezing out here." He didn't move. He just stared at me. His eyes were wide, dark, full of a heavy, suffocating sadness. "I heard you," Thomas whispered. Caleb stopped grinding the coffee beans. He turned around. "I heard you talking about the poison," Thomas said. His voice trembled. I stood up. I walked over to him and knelt down on the cold floor so we were eye to eye. "It's okay, Thomas. It's grown-up talk. The lawyers are just confused. We're going to fix it. They think you gave Father the bad water." "I know. But I didn't. You know I didn't." Thomas looked down at his bare toes. A tear slipped down his cheek. It fell onto the wooden floorboards. "I know you didn't," he whispered. "Exactly." I tried to smile. I reached out to touch his arm. "So don't worry." "I know you didn't," Thomas interrupted. His voice broke, A ragged, awful sob tore out of his little chest. Because I saw who did it. The air in the room vanished. I froze. Caleb froze. What did you say? I breathed. Thomas squeezed his eyes shut. The tears fell faster now. He was shaking violently. I was thirsty, he sobbed. That night, I woke up. I wanted a glass of milk. I went downstairs to the kitchen. He opened his eyes. They were wide with a terror he had been holding inside for 8 long months. Someone was in there, standing by the counter. They had Father's silver cup, the one he always takes to bed for his night water. My heart hammered against my ribs. Was it Uncle Edward? Thomas, did you see Uncle Edward? Thomas shook his head. No. Then who? Thomas looked at me, his little face crumpled. It was Mrs. Pembroke. I sat back on my heels. I felt like I had been struck by lightning. Mrs. Pembroke, the housekeeper. She had been with the Holland family for 20 years. She practically raised Jonathan. She was a quiet, severe woman who always wore black. She had always looked at me with a cold, distant disdain. But I thought it was just snobbery. Mrs. Pembroke? Caleb asked. He stepped closer. His voice was incredibly gentle. Thomas, are you sure? Thomas nodded frantically. She had a little glass bottle. She poured white powder into the cup. Then she stirred it. She was crying. She said if she couldn't have him, nobody could. I covered my mouth with both hands. A gasp tore from my throat. It all made sense. A terrible, sick kind of sense. Mrs. Pembroke had loved Jonathan, a twisted, silent obsession that spanned decades. When Margaret died, Pembroke probably thought her time had come. Then Jonathan hired me. Then he married me. She didn't do it for money. She did it out of spite, out of a jealous, festering rage. Why didn't you tell me? I asked, pulling Thomas into my arms. He collapsed against my shoulder, sobbing into my neck. Oh, my sweet boy, why didn't you tell me? I was scared, he wailed. Uncle Edward said you were going to hang. I thought if I told about Mrs. Pembroke, she would poison us too. I just wanted to keep Eliza and Benji safe. I rocked him. I held him so tight my arms ached. An 8-year-old boy, carrying the weight of a murder, carrying the secret of his father's death, terrified that the monster in the kitchen would come for his siblings next. I looked up at Caleb over my son's shaking shoulders. Caleb's eyes were ablaze, a cold, righteous fire. Edward didn't kill Jonathan. Edward was just a vulture. He found his brother dead. He found out what Mrs. Pembroke did, and instead of calling the law, he used it. He used the murder to frame me. He bought the apothecary. He forced me out. He kept the estate. Caleb, I whispered. I know. Caleb walked over. He laid a heavy, reassuring hand on Thomas's head. You did good, son. You're a brave boy. You don't have to carry this anymore. I'm taking it now. He looked at me. We need to write another letter, Caleb said. His voice was like iron. Right now, to Abernathy. Tell him to stop looking at Edward. Tell him to tear Mrs. Pembroke's room apart. I held my son. I felt the terror finally leaving his small body. We had the truth. Now we just had to survive long enough to use it. Late December in Wyoming is a test of a man's soul. The cold doesn't just sit on your skin. It gets into your bones. It makes the wood pop like gunshots in the middle of the night. Thaddeus Gale lasted exactly 6 days at the edge of my property. The cold finally beat him. He packed up his camp and rode back into Miller's Crossing, renting a room at the boarding house above the saloon. But he didn't leave. He was just waiting for the freeze to break, waiting for us to make a mistake. We didn't. We just waited for the stagecoach. It arrived on the 22nd of December. I was waiting in town. I stood on the boardwalk in front of Hannah's store. Gale was across the street, leaning against the post office wall, smoking a cigar, watching me. The stagecoach rumbled down the main drag. The horses were exhausted, their breath pluming in the freezing air. The coach slid to a halt in the rutted snow. The door opened. A man stepped out. He was in his late 50s, wearing a heavy wool ulster coat and a silk scarf. He had silver hair and eyes that were entirely too sharp for a tired traveler. He carried a leather briefcase. Henry Abernathy. He didn't look around at the town. He looked straight at me. I stepped off the boardwalk. Before I could reach the coach, Gale pushed off the post office wall. He walked fast, cutting across the frozen street, trying to intercept the lawyer. "Mr. Abernathy," Gale called out, tipping his bowler hat. "Thaddeus Gale. We corresponded in Boston. I represent Edward Holland." Abernathy stopped. He looked at the investigator. He didn't offer his hand. "I know who you are, Mr. Gale." Abernathy's voice was crisp, cultured, but hard as a diamond. "I assume you're here for the widow," Gale said, smiling that slick, empty smile. "I can save you the trouble. She's holed up at that rancher's place. If you have the federal warrant, I'd be happy to assist in the apprehension. For my agreed fee, of course." Abernathy looked at him for a long, quiet moment. Then Abernathy opened his leather briefcase. He pulled out a folded piece of heavy paper with a red wax seal. "I do have a warrant, Mr. Gale," Abernathy said. He handed the paper to the investigator. Gale took it. He unfolded it. His eyes scanned the text. I watched Gale's face. I watched the smug, arrogant confidence drain completely out of his features. His skin turned the color of old ash. "This," Gale stammered. "This is an arrest warrant. For Edward Holland." "Yes," Abernathy said pleasantly. "Signed by a federal judge in Massachusetts. Served 3 days ago. Edward is currently sitting in a cell in Boston." Gale stared at the paper. "On what charges?" "Conspiracy, extortion, false imprisonment, and accessory to murder after the fact." Abernathy reached out and plucked the paper right back out of Gale's hands. "Your employer's funds are frozen, Mr. Gale. You will not be receiving your fee. And if you are still in this territory by nightfall, I will have the local marshal arrest you for harassment. Good day." Abernathy turned his back on him. He walked straight toward me. Gale just stood there in the snow, a broken dog. I tipped my hat to Abernathy. "Mr. Whitfield?" he asked. "My wagon's over here," I said. We rode back to the ranch. Abernathy didn't say much on the ride. He just looked at the vast, empty plains. When we walked through the front door, Sarah was standing by the stove. She dropped her towel. "Henry," she breathed. Abernathy dropped his briefcase. He walked across the kitchen and wrapped his arms around her. He hugged her like a daughter. Sarah buried her face in his heavy coat and wept. A quiet, exhausted kind of weeping. The sound of a war finally ending. We sat at the kitchen table. I poured the coffee. "We got your second letter, Sarah," Abernathy said. His hands were wrapped around the hot tin cup. "The one about Thomas and Mrs. Pembroke." Sarah squeezed her eyes shut. "Was he right? Was it her?" Abernathy nodded grimly. "I went to the police," he said. "I used my influence to get a search warrant for her quarters. Since Edward fired her after Jonathan died, she was living in a cheap boarding house near the harbor. We tossed the room." Abernathy reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a small, leather-bound book. He set it on the table. "Her diary," Abernathy said. "She kept it for 15 years. It is disturbing reading. Pages and pages of obsession. She truly believed Jonathan belonged to her. When he married you, her mind finally snapped." Sarah stared at the little book like it was a coiled snake. "We found the real arsenic receipt folded inside the back cover," Abernathy continued. "Dated 6 months ago. She planned it for a long time. When the police confronted her, she broke. She confessed to everything." "And Edward?" I asked. "Edward didn't know about the poison until after Jonathan was dead," Abernathy said with deep disgust. "He found the arsenic bottle in Pembroke's room while searching for the will. He put 2 and 2 together. But instead of turning her in, he blackmailed her. He used the murder to frame Sarah. He paid a local street girl to walk into the Tremont pharmacy wearing a dark veil and sign Sarah's name." Abernathy reached across the table and took Sarah's hands. "It's over, Sarah," he said softly. "The charges against you are completely dropped. Edward is going to prison for a very long time. The estate, the money, the house, everything, It reverts to you, as Jonathan intended. Sarah didn't celebrate. She didn't smile. She just let out a long, shuddering breath. The kind of breath a drowning person takes when they finally break the surface. "You're free," Abernathy said. "You can come home to Boston." The word hung in the air. Home. I stood up from the table. The chair scraped loud against the floorboards. "I'll go check on the horses," I said. I didn't look at Sarah. I just grabbed my coat and walked out into the freezing wind. I went to the barn. I didn't check the horses. I just leaned my forehead against the rough wood of the stall door. I closed my eyes. I knew this day was coming. I prayed for it to come. I wanted her safe. I wanted her free. But freedom meant leaving. She belonged in a parlor in Boston. She belonged in silks with tutors for the children and society friends. She didn't belong in a drafty wooden box in Wyoming, scrubbing cast-iron skillets and mending torn coats. The barn door creaked open. I didn't turn around. I heard her soft footsteps in the hay. She stepped up beside me. She put her hand on my arm. "Caleb," she whispered. I straightened up. I looked at her. Her eyes were red from crying, but they were clear. For the first time since I met her, there was no fear in them. "You got a lot of packing to do," I said. I tried to keep my voice flat, professional. "Abernathy says the train leaves Cheyenne in 3 days. Ned and I can drive you in the buckboard. Wrap the kids in heavy blankets. We'll make it fine." She looked down at her hands. "I don't know what to do." "Yes, you do. Caleb, everything I have, my life, the children's lives, we owe it to you." I felt a flash of anger. Not at her. At the word. "You don't owe me a damn thing, Sarah." I stepped back. I needed distance. If I stood too close, I was going to pull her in. And if I pulled her in now, I'd be trapping her just as surely as Edward did. Just with a different kind of chain. "You are a wealthy, independent woman," I said, my voice hard, steady. "You have your name back. You have your kids. You need to go back to Boston." "You want me to leave?" Her voice cracked. "I want you to be free," I said fiercely. "And you can't be free if you stay here right now. If you stay here now, you're just staying out of gratitude. You're staying because I'm the man who dug the dirt off your face. That's not love, Sarah. That's a debt." A tear slipped down her cheek. "Go back to Boston," I told her. "Yes, walk into your big house. Sleep in your fine bed. Look at the life you had. Reclaim it. And when the dust settles, if you find yourself looking out the window and missing the Wyoming wind," I swallowed hard. My throat ached. "Then you make a choice. But it has to be a choice. Not a sanctuary." She stared at me. The tears were falling freely now, but she wasn't sobbing. She was looking at me like she was seeing me for the very first time. A man who loved her enough to push her away. She stepped forward. She didn't say a word. She just rose up on her toes, grabbed the lapels of my heavy coat, and pressed her lips to mine. It wasn't a desperate kiss. It was a promise. She pulled back. She looked me in the eyes. "I will go to Boston," she whispered. "I will handle Edward. I will handle the estate." She let go of my coat. She turned and walked out of the barn. I stood there in the quiet, listening to the wind, knowing the house was about to become very, very empty again. Boston is a loud city. Carriages rattling on cobblestones, street vendors shouting, the constant heavy hum of thousands of people living right on top of each other. For the first few weeks, the noise made me physically sick. I was used to the wind. I was used to the absolute terrifying silence of the plains. It had been 4 months since I left Wyoming. 4 months of velvet drapes, mahogany furniture, and lawyers. The trial was fast. Henry Abernathy was a force of nature in the courtroom. With Mrs. Pembroke's diary and her full confession, the judge didn't even need the jury to deliberate long. She was locked away in a state asylum. Edward was sentenced to 12 years in the federal penitentiary for conspiracy and false imprisonment. When the gavel fell, everyone expected me to cry, or cheer, or faint. I didn't do any of those things. I just adjusted my gloves and walked out of the courthouse. The estate was returned to me, the massive 12-room mansion on Beacon Hill, the bank accounts, the investments. I was, overnight, one of the wealthiest widows in Massachusetts. Society ladies who had crossed the street to avoid me a month ago suddenly started sending calling cards. They brought tea. They brought pity. They wanted to hear the scandalous details of my kidnapping. I threw their cards in the fire. One evening in late April, I was sitting in the grand parlor. The room was suffocating. Too much silk, too much silver. I watched the children. Thomas was wearing a perfectly tailored wool suit. He was sitting by the large bay window. He wasn't playing with his expensive tin soldiers. He was just staring out the glass, looking toward the setting sun, looking west. Eliza was on the Persian rug. She was trying to build a fence out of wooden building blocks. "What are you making, sweetie?" I asked. "A corral," she said without looking up. "For Mr. Caleb's horses. My doll is going to feed them." Benjamin was lying on his back, staring at the painted ceiling. "I miss the red chicken," he announced to nobody in particular. "And I miss old Ned. And I miss the snow." I looked at my 3 children. They were safe. They were wealthy. They had everything the world said they were supposed to have. But they were miserable. And so was I. We didn't live in this house anymore. Our bodies were in Boston, but our hearts were sitting in a drafty wooden cabin 3,000 miles away. The next morning, I put on my coat and walked down to Henry Abernathy's office. He was sitting behind his massive oak desk. He smiled when I walked in. "Sarah," he said warmly, "you look well. The color's coming back to your cheeks. What can I do for you today? Looking to adjust the investments?" I sat down in the leather chair opposite him. "I want to sell the house, Henry." He stopped sorting his papers. He looked up. "I'm sorry?" "The house on Beacon Hill. The furniture, the carriages, everything. I want it liquidated." Henry took off his spectacles. "Sarah, be reasonable. That is the Holland family estate. It's your children's inheritance." "No," I said. My voice was steady, hard. "Their inheritance is the money. Put the funds into an ironclad trust. Thomas, Eliza, and Benjamin will get equal shares when they turn 21. But I am not raising them in that museum." "Where will you live?" he asked, genuinely baffled. "You have the world at your feet here." "I don't want the world, Henry. I want 60 acres of dirt." He stared at me. He was a smart man. It didn't take him long to put the pieces together. "Wyoming," he breathed. "Sarah, you are a wealthy woman now. Caleb Whitfield is a good man, a great man, but he is a dirt rancher. If you go back to him, society will say you lost your mind. They will say you threw your life away. Let them say whatever they want." I leaned forward. I rested my hands flat on his desk. "Listen to me, Henry. Jonathan didn't leave me this estate so I could play the part of a high society queen. He left it to me so I could protect his children. And I can raise them better out there, where they can breathe, where they are judged by the work of their hands, not the label on their coats." "Caleb didn't ask you to come back," Henry pointed out gently. "I know, because he is a good man, because he refused to let me stay out of gratitude." I pulled a folded piece of paper from my purse. It was a property listing I had found through a Western land broker in the city. "There's a plot of land for sale, the old Wilson tract. It borders Caleb's property on the east side, 60 acres. I want you to buy it for me, outright, in my name." Henry looked at the paper, then he looked at me. A slow, respectful smile spread across his face. "You aren't going back to move into his house," Henry realized. "No," I said. "I'm going to build my own. I'm going to open a schoolhouse for the children in Miller's Crossing. I'm going to own my own cattle." I sat back in the chair. I felt a profound, deep sense of peace settle over my bones. "When I met Caleb Whitfield," I told the lawyer, "I was a corpse in the ground. He dug me out. He saved me. But if I go back to him empty-handed, I will always be the woman he rescued. I will always be the widow who needed a roof. I won't do it." I stood up. I buttoned my coat. "I'm going back to Wyoming, Henry, but I'm not going back as a charity case. I am going back as his equal. Spring in Wyoming is an ugly thing. The snow melts and the ground turns into a thick, sucking red mud. The rivers swell. The wind shifts from freezing to damp. It's the season of hard work, the kind of work that breaks your back and makes you sleep without dreaming. I welcomed it. I worked from sunup to sundown. I fixed every fence. I cleared the brush. I broke 2 new Mustangs. I did everything I could to stay out of the house, because the house was dead. When Sarah and the kids left in January, they took all the noise with them. They took the smell of fresh bread. They took the scuff marks on the floorboards. The silence they left behind wasn't the comfortable quiet I was used to before they arrived. It was a heavy, suffocating silence. It had been 4 months. I didn't get any letters. I didn't expect any. I told her to go reclaim her life, and she did. That was the right thing, the honorable thing. But honor doesn't keep you warm at night. It was mid-May. I was out on the eastern boundary line working on a stretch of barbed wire that a stray bull had trampled. My hands were covered in grease and mud. Sweat stung my eyes. The property right next to mine, the old Wilson place, had been abandoned for 2 years. Just empty, rolling prairie grass. I swung my hammer, driving a heavy iron staple into a cedar post. Thwack! I paused to wipe my brow. Then I heard it. The rattle of wheels, not a freight wagon. Too light, too fast. I turned around. Coming down the muddy trail from Miller's Crossing was a rented carriage, a good one, pulled by a team of matching bays. I froze. I dropped the hammer. The carriage slowed as it approached my property line. It didn't stop at my gate. It pulled right up to the spot where I was standing by the fence. The carriage door flew open before the wheels even stopped rolling. "Mr. Caleb!" A small blur of motion launched out of the door. It hit my leg so hard I stumbled backward into the mud. It was Benjamin. He was wearing a fancy little suit, but he didn't care about the mud. He wrapped his arms around my knees and squeezed. Right behind him came Eliza. She threw herself at my waist. "You didn't fix the corral yet," she yelled, her face buried in my coat. "I told Mama you'd need help." I dropped to my knees in the dirt. I wrapped my thick, muddy arms around both of them. My chest seized up. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't speak. I just held them. Then Thomas stepped down from the carriage. He didn't run. He walked. He was taller, standing straighter. He walked right up to me, stopped, and held out his hand, like a man. I wiped the mud off my right hand onto my denim pants. I shook his hand. Firm. "Good to see you, son," I managed to choke out. "Good to be home, sir," Thomas said. I looked up. Sarah was stepping out of the carriage. She didn't look like the terrified woman I pulled out of the dirt. She didn't look like the haunted fugitive hiding in my kitchen. She wore a practical, heavy cotton dress, good leather boots, no veil, no black mourning clothes. The Wyoming sun hit her face and her eyes were bright, alive, sharp. She walked toward me, her boots sinking slightly into the mud. She didn't care. I stood up. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might crack them. "Sarah?" "Hello, Caleb." I didn't know what to do with my hands. I didn't know what to say. "You're just visiting?" I asked. I braced myself for the answer, preparing for the letdown. Sarah stopped 3 feet away. She reached into her leather satchel. She pulled out a heavy piece of paper with a government seal on it. She handed it to me. "I need a favor, Mr. Whitfield," she said. Her voice was perfectly serious, but the corners of her mouth were twitching. I looked at the paper. It was a property deed for the Wilson tract, 60 acres of prime grazing land, completely paid for. Listed owner, Sarah Abigail Holland. My brain stuttered. I looked from the paper to her face. "Sarah, what is this?" "That is my land," she said. She pointed past me to the empty prairie. "I sold the house in Boston. The kids' money is in a trust. I bought the Wilson place. I've hired a crew from Cheyenne. They start building my house next week, and a schoolhouse right next to it." I stood there like a struck steer, dumbfounded. "You moved next door." "I did. Why?" She took a step closer. She didn't flinch away from the mud on my coat. She reached out and touched my arm. "Because," Sarah said softly, 4 months ago, you told me to go back and look at my life. You told me I needed to make a choice, and that it couldn't be out of gratitude. You didn't want me to be a rescue." She looked deep into my eyes. "You were right, Caleb. If I came back to your house under your roof with no money and no name, I would just be your dependent. I didn't survive the grave to be anyone's dependent. She tapped the deed in my hand. I have my own land now. I have my own money. I have my own house coming. I don't need you to save me anymore, Caleb. I don't need you to put a roof over my head. I swallowed hard. Then what do you need me for? A slow, beautiful smile broke across her face. I need you to help me fix this fence line, since it belongs to both of us now. I stared at her. The sheer, terrifying brilliance of this woman. She hadn't come back to surrender to me. She had come back to stand shoulder to shoulder with me. Not as a damsel in distress, as a partner, an equal. I couldn't help it. I started to laugh. It rolled out of me, loud and deep, a sound that chased the last of the winter chill right off the plains. You are the most stubborn, complicated woman God ever put on this earth, I said. I know, she smiled. Are you complaining, neighbor? No, ma'am, not at all. I looked at the kids. They had run off toward my barn, chasing the barn cat, completely ignoring the mud ruining their eastern clothes. Come with me, I said. I didn't take her to the house. I took her down the river bend, to the lone oak tree. The grass had started to grow back over the mound of dirt. The wooden cross I made was still there, weathered by the snow, but standing straight. We stood in front of it, side by side. Why haven't you taken the cross down? Sarah asked quietly. I'm not in there. I know, I said. I took my hat off. I held it by my side. But the woman who went into that ground, the one who thought her life was over, the one who gave up, she is in there. She died that day, and I figured she deserved a marker, because her dying is what let you live. Sarah looked at the cross. She reached out and traced the carved letters with her gloved fingers, saved by grace. She didn't cry, she just nodded. She was so tired, Caleb, Sarah whispered. That poor woman, she was just so tired. She can rest now, I said. You took over the watch. Sarah turned to face me. The wind caught her dark hair. I'm having dinner at my camp tonight, she said. Her voice was low, rhythmic, steady. Old Ned is helping us set up the tents until the cabin is built. I'm making stew if you're hungry. I could eat. And maybe tomorrow, she continued, stepping a fraction of an inch closer, you could come over and help me measure the foundation for the schoolhouse. I could do that. And maybe, she looked down at my muddy hands, then back up to my eyes, when the house is finished, I might invite you inside. I'll wait on the porch till you do. She smiled. She reached out and took my hand. She didn't care about the mud or the grease. She just intertwined her fingers with mine. We didn't kiss. We didn't need to. Not yet. A kiss is a promise for the end of a story, and our story wasn't ending. It was just starting to get good. We just stood there by the oak tree, holding hands. Two people who had been broken by the world, who had walked through the fire and the dirt, and somehow found each other on the other side. I looked out across the 60 acres she just bought. The grass was green, the sky was wide. I was a man who dug a woman out of the ground. She was a woman who built a kingdom on top of it. And as the Wyoming wind rushed through the branches above us, I knew for the very first time in my life that I was exactly where I was supposed to be.
Out here on the frontier, where the wind never asks permission and the land doesn't forgive weakness, people like to believe that survival is all that matters. But this story proves something deeper, something harder to hold onto than a rifle or a fence post. It shows us that survival alone is not what keeps a person alive. It's connection. It's the quiet, stubborn decision to care about someone else when it would be easier not to. What happened on that frozen stretch of Wyoming soil wasn't just a rescue, it was a turning point. A man who had buried his heart along with his past chose, in one single moment, to listen, to question, to act. And because of that choice, a mother came back from the edge of death, 3 children were given back their future, and a broken house found life again. That's the kind of power one human being holds. the power to interrupt tragedy. But the lesson doesn't stop there. This story reminds us that truth isn't always loud. Sometimes it's buried, hidden beneath lies, fear, and silence. That young boy carried the weight of truth in his chest, terrified to speak it, yet it was that truth that held the key to justice. And that tells us something important. Courage doesn't always look like strength. Sometimes it looks like a trembling voice finally saying, "I saw what really happened." There's also something to be said about love, real love, not the kind written in poetry or promised in easy times, but the kind that chooses to stay when everything is uncertain. Sarah wasn't bound to those children by blood, but by something stronger: choice, sacrifice, and unwavering devotion. And Caleb, a man who had every reason to stay distant from the world, chose to stand beside her, not because he had to, but because it was right. In a world driven by law, money, and reputation, they chose something rarer: loyalty. And maybe that's the heart of it all. In the Wild West, or anywhere worth living, what defines us isn't what we've lost, or what the world accuses us of being. It's what we choose to do when faced with someone else's pain. It's whether we turn away or step closer. So when you walk away from this story, remember this: never be too certain of what you think you know. Never ignore a cry for help, no matter how faint. And never underestimate the quiet strength of compassion. It has the power to pull people out of the darkest places imaginable. Because sometimes, the difference between a grave and a second chance is just one person willing to believe there's still life beneath the surface. All characters and situations in this book are fictional and developed for narrative purposes. The author does not intend to reflect or comment on any real individual or event. Readers should approach the story as a work of fiction, not as a factual account.